Hello, this is Carolyn Brown speaking, and we are beginning the webinar this afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. The title of the webinar is Reading Intervention When the Traditional Mastery Model Doesn't Work. And very first, I would like to just quickly review what we'll be doing over the next hour, and then we'll get right into introducing our speakers. And then we hope very much that we'll get feedback and questions and your thoughts, and we have selected the last part of the webinar to review those. And if you have questions as we're going along, in the bottom quarter of the right-hand part of the screen is a Q&A box, and you can write questions, and we will be reading those and organizing them, and then we'll answer those at the end of the session. So this afternoon, the very first thing that we'll do after introducing the panel is have Dr. Robert McMurray from the University of Iowa talk about an alternative to the mastery model. And then we'll have a principal and two interventionists and teachers discuss a case study that was performed at Hillside Elementary in West Des Moines, Iowa. We'll briefly tell you about access code, and then we'll move to questions and answers. So the panel this afternoon will be Dr. Robert Davis, who's a leading principal in Iowa. He has two of his specialists here with us this afternoon, Christy Dietzenbach and Suzanne Walsh, and they both are long-term teachers and interventionists. We have Professor Bob McMurray from the University of Iowa, and I am Carolyn Brown with the University of Iowa, and I'm also the co-founder and co-developer of Foundations in Learning in the Product Access Code. So before we start, I would just like to provide a very broad context in which this project began and where we've come from the beginning of the project. For about 20 years, we have worked in the public schools in the area of literacy. We developed and implemented breakthroughs to literacy across the country. And during that time, we had the opportunity to observe that between 15 and 40% of students across the country in every school struggled with automaticity of basic word recognition skills. Of course, if you don't have automaticity, that will influence fluency and comprehension. And after we were no longer with Breakthrough to Literacy, we had the opportunity to meet a little girl who was a third grader, and her name was Jessica. She was very highly motivated, very bright. She was struggling with fluency and reading comprehension, even though she had a history of having many interventions from the time she was actually in kindergarten. And it was really clear to us that Jessica lacked automaticity, and she lacked automaticity in decoding. She struggled to distinguish vowel ambiguities, and she struggled with any opportunity that she had to solve a problem where there was lack of one-to-one correspondence. She didn't use the structure of the syllable, and she didn't map phrases to underlying syntax. And as we've talked to educators around the country, they've identified Jessica's in every one of their schools as well. And it was clear to us when we sat down and tried to help solve Jessica's problem that after all the interventions that she had had, we had to do something different. And we were aware of findings in cognitive science, and we decided to try another approach. And so we went to cognitive science for a model that is very different, and it's very different from the mastery approach, and that's what we'd like to talk to you today. So after we worked with Jessica, and we worked with her for about a year, and she did improve her comprehension and fluency significantly. And we then performed additional case studies, worked in small group school-based studies, Working with Dr. McMurray, we performed some randomized studies in West Des Moines, and the principal and his teachers will talk about that study, and also in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And then Dr. McMurray will talk about the NSF grant that actually tested the underlying premise of this new model for word recognition. So now I would like to introduce you to Professor McMurray. And Professor McMurray actually is a recent honoree, or was honored by the American Psychology Association and received the Young Scientist Award this year. He's in both the Department of Psychology and the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. And we feel really lucky that we have actually been able to work with him, and his skills in bringing cognitive science and current work to education, and his deep understanding of learning principles will inform education currently, and we're certainly, we feel comfortable that he'll be working in informing teaching practices for years to come. So with that,
thank you for the lovely introduction.
I'm just going to hand it over to Bob, and I would like to actually ask you a question to get the webinar kicked off. Obviously, all of us on the webinar are thinking about reading comprehension, and we know that if we don't help these youngsters get automaticity in decoding, word attack, and fluency, they really cannot get to comprehension. Can you talk about generally what automaticity means?
Yeah, if we think about what children need to progress through to be good readers, ultimately, of course, the goal is to get them to understanding text. But we all know that for very early readers and struggling readers, being able to access the sound pattern of text is crucial. And what automaticity means in that context is that they can do it quickly, and they don't have to think about it. And that gives them the time and the cognitive resources then to start working on the higher level aspects of language. And the sort of pivotal or critical example of that would be something like driving. When you're driving a car, we don't remember that we have to push the brakes to stop. We don't think about what to do. We just do it. It's a very Nike approach. And the goal is to do it flexibly, of course. We don't use the exact same action sequence every time we get on the highway. What we do is very quickly and very implicitly solve the problems that come up on the road every day without necessitating a reasoning process or a conceptualization. You just do it.
Okay, so I think the reading, the driving experiment or example is really great, but could you help us sort of move that into reading and think about it more directly about how we help kids get there with reading?
Well, I think the critical distinction is between knowledge and skills. In cognitive science and in work on learning and memory, knowledge and skills work a little bit differently. We think about knowledge in terms of rules and concepts and explicit understanding, and skills are things that are more like driving a car. And I think this distinction is critical. Reading is clearly a skill. It's really a complex set of skills that all get put together in the moment. And we want kids to be able to read in this automatic, fluid way. But we often teach reading, especially some of the early stages, in terms of knowledge, and we talk about it that way. We talk about ideas like whether kids get the concept of a syllable or whether they understand the rules of phonics. We don't necessarily talk about whether they can do it, whether they can actually use the rules, or whether they can deploy that knowledge in the situation. And that's the critical distinction. I think the phonics rules that we all know and love from our own education, some of us at least, are maybe a great example. These are the rules like when you get a silent E after a vowel, you use the long form of the vowel. And they're very explicit, and we teach kids to understand these rules, and we learn to apply them. And that actually works well for a lot of kids. But in some ways, this is really an approximation of what's really going on. When linguists go into language and look closely, for example, they've uncovered over 1,200 phonics rules that are needed to capture the sound pattern of English. And then there are still exceptions. So there's a limit to what knowledge could get us. There's a limit to how much you can really cram in at the level of conceptual understanding. And we might do a little bit better by considering this as a skill to be taught, as a flexible, automatic skill.
Okay, so now take it one step further, Bob. What does this mean for teaching?
Well, we hear a lot about teaching right now in our sort of popular and public discourse. And I think this actually takes a little bit of the emphasis off teaching. I think it really puts the emphasis on how children learn, and that's what we need to think about. How kids learn and the conditions under which kids learn is really critical for success. Now, of course, the teacher plays a really important part of that, but we need to be thinking, I think, a little more closely about learning. And that means that for us as educators, and I don't teach reading, but I do teach psychology to lots of students, so I think about this quite a bit. We need to incorporate the principles of learning into our teaching. No matter what curriculum we're using, there's always a place to put these principles.
Okay, so perhaps you can talk to us now about what we do know or what has been learned about how people learn new skills.
Well, work on psychology and cognitive science has identified a lot of different principles of learning that could be potentially applied to the classroom. And the one that I want to talk about in particular today is the notion of variability. And just to go back to the driving example, you wouldn't learn to drive a car by driving in the exact same car on the exact same roads at the exact same time of day with the same other cars and drivers on the road under the same weather conditions, listening to the same music. What you would do is learn to drive under lots of different conditions, with lots of different types of situations, on the highway and in the town, in the city. And that's what you need to develop the ability to generalize the skills that people have. And it turns out when you take this idea into the laboratory, you see a lot of evidence for this. So there's some classic work on people shooting basketballs from the foul line. And what we find is that when you're learning to shoot from the foul line, you'd think if I practiced it from exactly the right distance, that would be best. But in fact, if you have people practice from variable distances, they learn better. Another great example, work on teaching pilots to land planes, in the flight simulator, of course, shows that when they get more variability, even in things as simple as the color of the ground, they learn to land a plane better. And in my own lab, we've been working with very young infants, infants as young as 14 months, and we show that when they're trying to learn two very similar sounding words, like ball and doll, they actually learn them better if they're said by lots and lots of different people. Now, all of this is kind of not obvious at first. It seems like when you add this kind of variability, what you're really doing is making the job harder. And yet we find in a sort of robust way that they learn better. And the explanation is really quite simple. Kids and learners don't know what all the parts of the problem are. When you're landing a plane, you don't know what all the perceptual cues are that tell you what the right approach angle is. And what variability does is it makes some sort of wash out. It forces you to generalize across a range of abilities or a range of factors to get to the more abstract principle.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of areas in which variability is really important. And you talked about making what's important pop out by the experience. Can you take that to reading practice and contrast what a lot of us are very familiar with in terms of the mastery approach, and then talk about how the varied practice could impact teaching reading?
Sure. One of the things that we know about the kids who struggle with particularly things like decoding and fluency is that vowels are really, really hard for them. Like you were saying about Jessica, when vowels have a lot of ambiguity, and that's what's difficult. When you see an A, it could be an A, it could be part of a diphthong like EA, which is pronounced E, it could be an A, and kids have to learn to sort this out. Now, one of the things that we now know, I think, is that kids in the early stages don't always know the difference between vowels and consonants, and they really don't always know the role that vowels play in organizing syllables. This, of course, is at an explicit knowledge level. And if you were to take this mastery or knowledge-based approach further, what you would want to do is sort of give them examples of the structure of a syllable with the vowel in the middle and the consonants on the outside, teach them how they might play different roles. And the typical way we would teach them is by just giving them things like word families, highly similar sets of words that really illustrate the principle. So mat, rat, and fat really illustrate the principle of how an A works. And mate, rate, and fate really illustrate that principle. So the idea is we can selectively tune out a lot of the noise and narrow in on what they really need to learn. So that's the mastery approach. Now, the alternative, however, is variability. The alternative is what we really want kids to learn from this experience is that the consonants are less relevant to the way the vowel should sound. And the way you do that is to give them lots of variability. You give them mad, you give them bag, you give them rap, you give them late game and save. And the idea here is that by having so much variability across the consonants, they never really learn to associate the consonants with the pronunciation of the vowel. And they get down to the underlying regularity that's there in the thing.
And
now, we've actually tested this in a recent study we conducted at the West Des Moines School District. What we did was we taught children a very small number of phonics rules for vowels. We taught them 3 short vowels and 3 diphthongs over just a short period of time, about 4 or 5 days. And the critical thing was the words that we used to instantiate it. So for some of the kids, they got words with very similar consonants, much like the bat, rat, hat example I gave you a minute ago. Other kids, however, had much more variable words. They all had the same number of words. It was just a matter of whether the words were similar to each other or variable. After this very short training, we tested them on their ability to use these words. And as you can see from the data I've presented here, at pre-test, the 2 groups were equal, but at post-test, the group getting variable words had almost doubled the gains of the group getting similar words. And we went on to show in this study that this leads to better generalization to new words and to better generalization to new tasks. So for example, if they were trained on tasks where they had to fill in the missing vowel or where they had to choose words that sounded alike, they could generalize that better to, say, spelling tasks or to reading tasks. And so in this very sort of simple, but I think very powerful design, we've isolated the variability and shown that it has a very strong and robust effect on learning. The bottom line from this, I think, is that we as teachers and educators, we're already readers. We know what's relevant. We look at a CVC, a very simple word like bad, and say that's the vowel and that's the important thing. And we know to tune out the consonants. But kids don't at this point. These were first grade children. They're still learning this thing. And the variability allowed them to sort of let the vowel pop out and the relevant things pop out so they could abstract over the consonants. And this does so in a way that kids don't ever have to think about it. They don't have to reason about it. What they need to do is do these tasks over and over again until the statistics and the input do the work.
And so can you talk then a little bit about implicit versus explicit here?
Yeah, I think in this case, we never actually taught the kids or even told the kids what the phonics rules were. We didn't ask them to learn those. What we asked them to do is a variety of tasks that use the phonics rules. We asked them to fill in missing letters. We asked them to choose words that sound alike. We asked them to select the right word. And in the course of doing that, they learned the regularities inherent in the language that enabled them to solve those tasks very accurately. And it's this approach that really helps you harness variability. And this could be applied to almost anything. You could think about learning different classes of phonics rules. You could think about variation in the syllable structure to help teach kids how to learn to generalize across syllables, or variation in the kinds of tasks that we do with kids. All of that is essential.
And so when you started the discussion and you said you don't have to think about it, you just do it. By just doing it in many different tasks, what the children are actually doing is deriving what's important rather than us telling them and them having to know it. Is that right?
That's exactly right. They're basically discovering it on their own, but they may never be able to verbalize it. They may never be able to say, oh, I know the long A rule. Yet, they can use it in the moment, and in some ways that's really what's important here.
Okay. So maybe you could then just talk to us very briefly about the key principles of learning that are really important to your experiment and then generalizing that more broadly.
Yes, I think it's very simple. One is that kids need lots of different tasks. They need to learn that they're not always going to be reading out loud or spelling or filling in missing letters. They need to learn the regularities that support all of those. But they also need a lot of data. You can imagine if variability in the consonants is what's important, you want to see as many consonants as you possibly can. And they need to get a lot of information. They need to get it in rapid succession. The other thing, of course, that's important is variability. But it's not just any variability. You don't want to just change everything. That's going to make the task more hard. You need to change the right things. That is, you need to make things that are irrelevant to what you're trying to teach variable, and things that are relevant to what you're trying to teach less variable. And that is the really critical thing. And
so can you talk about how technology might play a role in this, and this whole model of statistical learning?
Well, technology obviously isn't the only way to teach, but it has some real potentials here in a couple of places. One is that you can deliver more words with more feedback to children over a computer system than anywhere else. You can also control the variability and the properties of the stimuli anywhere else. So as a way to supplement the kind of classroom teaching they're getting in the real-world practice with more information, with more practice, with more variability on the right dimension, technology can play a really critical role.
Because technology could actually set up those contrasts in a way that then they would have experience. What's important pops out for them. They do it, they learn it, and they derive it.
Exactly. And it puts the emphasis more on doing it than knowing it.
All right. Well, that was a very fast review of cognitive science and some learning principles. And what I would like to do next is to actually let you know what we've been doing, and we feel really lucky, as I mentioned earlier, that we've had the opportunity to work with Bob. We're all from the University of Iowa, and we've also had a great opportunity to work with one of the leading principals and his staff in Iowa. And the issue that we were trying to solve was actually working with students who continued to struggle, even as they've gone through various interventions. They still struggle with fluency and comprehension because they don't have automaticity. So we identified a way that we could actually work with a web-delivered intervention to improve automaticity, and by doing that, we've enhanced both fluency and comprehension. And what we have done is, we believe, created an innovative way to take what cognitive science has taught us and instructional design, using this proven model of learning, the varied practice model, and we've developed a way to deliver opportunities and experiences to youngsters so they actually can derive the information that's important. So this sort of schematic identifies what we tried to do, and hopefully you can see the links to Bob's very thorough but brief explanation about how varied practice is actually very important to learning new skills. So we developed a curriculum that actually links decoding, word attack or multisyllabic words, and phrase recognition skills. And each one of the lessons, we've devised ways that what is really important to pop out is contrasted with other words, multisyllabic words or phrases, so the students actually have many opportunities to take this curriculum, and we actually pour it into a varied practice learning model so that we systematically have the children experience multiple tasks, 20 different tasks, and looking at these very specific contrasts so they can derive what's important. And this could not actually happen unless we had technology which took what the youngster was doing and then it personalized and optimized what the contrasts were or what the student needed to actually support generalization. So even though, Bob, most of your discussion was about vowels and the single syllable, what we've attempted to do in working with you and the school in West Des Moines is to see if we can take that same set of principles, move it to actually quickly recognizing multisyllabic words and then actually mapping that to the phrase structure.
I think that's the right approach, is to take this underlying principle that we've tested in one domain and to build an approach to learning around it. And
so we would like now to introduce to you our team that is in West Des Moines today, and I would just like to make a note that this school was under construction this year and it wasn't quite finished when school started. So they have been displaced, and we would just like to thank them for being so gracious to continue with this webinar, even though their life is a little bit disorganized right now. They've done a fabulous job, obviously, moving their kids into a new place and starting school. Dr. Robert Davis, who is the principal at Hillside. We have worked with him for a number of years, and he, as I said earlier, is a leading principal in Iowa for testing new ideas and being very focused on students who struggle to read. And with him today are Christy Dietzenbach and Suzanne Walsh. Christy's had 15 years of experience, and Suzanne has had more than 20. They both have been classroom teachers, literacy teachers, Title I, and reading interventionists. And with that, I would just like to turn it over to Dr. Davis in West Des Moines and have him actually explain what the project was and what results they learned.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think I'll talk just briefly a little bit about West Des Moines for the audience. It is the 9th largest district in Iowa. It's a suburb of Des Moines. The district that I've worked in for about 23, 24 years, and over the time period we've seen tremendous increases, like many other suburbs or other urban areas or other parts of our country, with tremendous increases in poverty, tremendous increases in educational backgrounds, diversity of our learners, high numbers of students who come in speaking a second language. West Des Moines is a very high-performing district, has very high expectations, and due to some of the demographics that I just described, having students who do not learn to read and read well is it's just unacceptable in our school district. So we're very blessed in West Des Moines. We have tremendous materials. We have great curriculum frameworks that we work from. We have tremendous supports with the teaching staff. Our training is second to none. So we have highly skilled teachers. They know a lot about how to teach children to read. They have the materials. They have the knowledge. But in spite of all these conditions that we think would lead to all kids being proficient in learning to read, we still had a niche of readers that we were quite concerned about. They were failing, and we were concerned about this failure. So at Hillside, next slide please. Hillside was built about 9 years ago, and it was actually a school where we took two Title I schools, two low-performing Title I schools, and we combined them into one, and the district really emphasized that we wanted to change the conditions in our schools so that we would have very, very high achievement compared to the other schools in our district. This was Hillside is a school where we used a lot of the balanced literacy framework, lots of emphasis on shared and guided reading and independent reading, tremendous emphasis on training our staff on effective practice. Often we had a very large research space behind what we were doing and why we were doing it. And overall, I characterize my staff as being one that they really do have a very deep understanding of how students learn. And as we study our data and as we look at our school improvement goals and we work with our incentive plans, over the 9-year period that we've been open, we still continue to see a niche of students that no matter how we serve these kids, no matter how many intervention groups we developed or how many theories we developed about why they weren't learning, we always fell back that we had a need here, and it wasn't being fulfilled with what our educational practices and what we were delivering to kids. So in that time period, we were very fortunate to develop a relationship with Dr. Zimmerman and Dr. Brown, University of Iowa. We brought them in on many occasions, and we would essentially do case studies with children that had varied backgrounds, but they did have common denominators. They had certain things that they just weren't able to perform when they were learning how to read. And so just through these relationships and through these conversations, we started working. We started a working interest conducting some research at Hillside using access code our means of conducting this research, doing some investigations, really studying deeply what is it that is causing these children their failure in learning how to read. Next slide, please.
Actually, can you go back 2 slides to our challenges?
So,
thank you.
I've kind of given some background here at Hillside Elementary School, and I'm going to ask Christy and Suzanne, what do you think our challenges were with the struggling readers from your perspective as reading teachers and reading interventionists?
You know, there were many struggles in all the grade levels we worked in, and Christy and I mainly worked in maybe 2nd through 5th grade. But what we really noticed was when the students read, they were stuck on the decoding part of the text. And since it was so labored, we never really got to the encoding. They were having trouble making meaning because they could not sound out the words. They could not syllabicate words. And we also noticed there was a really large, they didn't know their vowel sounds. So when they came to a word, they were mixing up their vowel sounds. And when we worked with the students, let's say on vowel sounds, we would provide them with several index cards, let's say of short A. Well, when we did that, maybe we came up with 50 cards with the vowel sounds on them. It still wasn't enough. And so when we got this varied practice model, and when the students are working on the computer, the students would have, let's say, 500 different exposures with short vowel sounds, and we could never replicate that. Christy, would you agree with me?
I totally agree with you, Suzanne. One of the things as being a Title I teacher, I see a lot of those students that have moved around a lot. So they're transients. They come into 3rd and 4th grade and they have gaps all over with their phonics skills, spelling, writing. And when we get to 3rd grade, we all know that those upper elementary kids are spending so much time on comprehension, they don't have all that time to work on decoding. So what we were really looking for at Hillside was something to help us reach that niche of students who still needed those phonics skills. You can move to the next slide. So that's where Access Code came in.
So we've described a school where it really wasn't about materials. We had sufficient materials. We had a pretty strong philosophical framework with balanced literacy. We had good parent involvement. We had teachers with very strong understanding of how to teach kids to read. And obviously we're using assessment data all the time to monitor these kids and really try to diagnose why they're not learning to read. And so we just decided that maybe this niche of students that we've been talking about throughout the webinar, maybe Access Code might be a good match for our students, for our school, and for all the learning conditions that we were trying to create in an elementary school of 600 students.
Next slide, please.
So Christy, why don't you talk a little bit about how we went about implementing this in grades 3 through 6 with our staff?
So over the past almost 4 years ago, we pretty much started with a small intervention team of your ESL teachers, your reading teachers, your Title I teachers, and we're taking those groups of selected struggling learners, those kids that are having that niche of not knowing their phonics, couldn't figure out what those gaps were and everything, and started studying them. And then in 2009, Carolyn and Jerry approached us and asked if we could do a randomized control study using Access Code. So in that year, and I will talk a little bit more about the results in that a little bit, but in that year we had 7 teachers participate in selecting these students, and then some of them were on Access Code, and some of them were just in their groups doing their normal group activity every day. And then after that year, we went to looking at the struggling readers and all 3rd graders. Well, excuse me, about 90 students in the year 2010, 2011, and then last year we talked about the struggling readers, and we spent a lot of time with the 3rd graders.
So Suzanne, when we go about implementing new programs or new ideas, we typically will see effects on both the teachers and the students. What kinds of things did you observe as a reading resource teacher at Hillside?
You know, I'm going to talk about the teachers first. What I really started to notice was the teachers were learning from using the very practice model, the access code. They were watching the students on the computer and then working afterwards with the students and listening to their reading records. And then I started noticing the teachers were applying what they were noticing with the students on access code to all of their students. And we were able to make generalizations like, hey, when the kids get up into the upper grades, we're really noticing that the students are having problems sounding out multisyllabic words, or the students aren't really self-correcting. And so then we could go back and work with the students on many lessons and see if we could work with all students on those skills. And with the students, we noticed that you really did have to keep track of where the student was and perform a reading record every week and analyze that and work with the student on where their point of need was to see the progression of where they were going. And when the students came in the room every day to work on the computer, the teacher had to buy into where the student was and know exactly, hey, what skill are you working on today, and watch them on the computer so that they knew they had so invested in the program.
So with any initiative or any kind of action, we're asking teachers to make some changes. What did teachers have to do differently, and what training and professional development did we provide to everyone that was involved with access code to ensure that we were delivering this correctly and that hopefully we'd have some positive results on student learning?
So 3 years ago, for professional development to get us started in access code, like I had stated, we had 7 original teachers that kind of started piloting the program first, and they were our ESL teachers, our reading teachers, and Title I teachers. And from that small group of teachers, we spent about once a month in small meetings talking about the students, and it was really what we learned from the students that led us to what do we have to know as a teacher to help those students be successful. And through those monthly meetings, and then watching the tutorial videos and having some training from Jerry and Carolyn, we were able to take what we knew and expand it to all the classroom teachers. So by this time last year, we had 20 teachers that knew enough about access code that they were able to implement it in their classroom with their own small group. Want to add anything to that?
You know, I think it's really interesting that when we got together and worked on the professional development, the conversation shifted with the teachers. They really talked about what they observed in the students' learning. And I think that was really helpful so we could move on with the students' progression of learning. Mm-hmm.
So the whole experience really had a value-added effect on us. It really raised our knowledge levels on what works to help students learn to read, and then another side of that was there are children who aren't learning, and we have an explanation of why, and we were able to provide an intervention that was effective in their behalf.
So to go back to our case study of our original 22 students, of those 22 students, they were in grades 2nd through 6th grade at that time. And we did all the regular assessments at the beginning of the school year. We did running records, we found reading levels, we did DIBELS testing for nonsense word recognition, oral reading fluencies, and also we used their ITBS reading comprehension scores. And from those 22 students, only 11 of them were in that treatment group that got to use access code. But everything else was originally the same. They just went on the computer for an additional 20 minutes each day, and everything else the teacher did the same as the small group of the other kids. Out of those 22, 7 of them were ESL students, and they made tremendous growth. And out of all the students in those 22, everyone was safe. They made that growth that they needed to be successful, and as you can see in the bar graph, the treatment group rose the next year in their comprehension on ITBS. Also in that whole group, out of those 22 students, only one of those students was a struggling reader, ended up being placed in special education 2 years later for reading.
So let's kind of go a little bit further with this in terms of just the overall impact and our observations in terms of kind of leading this research and leading this use of access code. What have we observed about our students? What do we see them doing differently maybe than what we saw 3, 4, 5 years ago?
You know, what I'm going to talk about a particular student, and he was a 5th grader when we started working with him in the very practice model. And when I first sat down to read with him, he looked at me and said, I am not a reader. I can't read fluently. He was embarrassed about his reading and that he read so slowly. So I thought he was a great candidate to be in access code. And his confidence as we went through the 23-week program really soared, and most of all, his fluency improved. So he did sound like his classmates. And when independent reading went on in the classroom, I observed he started picking up books more and more willing to read independently. I also noticed he had, it took effect in all of his subject areas where he was learning more and applying what he knew in his reading. Christy, do you have anything to add to that?
And just a second, some of the things that Suzanne said, kids really were motivated and engaged in the very practice model that they're using with all the different skills that they could use, and they were applying it into their daily reading, and fluency was increasing. So we are going to continue to plan to use access code this year. So if you've seen our future plans.
Well, we're really concerned about ensuring that all of our students are becoming proficient with their reading. So this year we're going to use access code with all our 3rd grade students. I'm going to continue to do some research with Dr. Brown. And then 2nd grade students, 2nd semester, we kind of think that developmentally when the vowels really start coming into play for 2nd graders, it's about that 2nd semester. So we're going to implement access code with 2nd grade students and then continue to use it with our students who are identified in special education grades 3 through 6. It's a continued effort to really deepen our understanding of why students learn to read well and why students don't learn to read, and it's going to continue to elevate the conversations that we have at our school about what conditions do we need to create to make sure that learning for all takes place.
Dr. Davis, Christy, and Suzanne, thank you so very much for your participation this afternoon. And Bob, I think Dr. McMurray here, they're both Bob, so it's a little confusing here, but Dr. McMurray, I think, wants to follow up with a couple of questions to you.
Well, I just wanted to add a little bit to what you were saying. You know, I think your goal of extending this to all readers is really a great one. This is a principle that applies across the board. And what we found in our much smaller scale study of vowels is when we broke out the good readers and the poor readers, that both groups benefited from the inclusion of a more varied practice schedule. Interestingly, the poor readers did a lot better. They really needed it. Without that, they completely did not show any evidence of learning at all. The good readers also benefited from it, although they could also benefit from more similarity. And so I think this really supports your decision to take this to everyone.
Okay, and there were several questions I think that might have come in during the course of the webinar, and we have a few minutes now, and perhaps we could address those directly.
So one participant asked about the statistical significance of our small-scale study in the West Des Moines district, and you can take a look at the paper, which just came out in developmental psychology, but all of our results were highly statistically significant. P-value is way less than 0.05. Now you might say, well, but you only got a 3% improvement, or you only got a 6% improvement in the variability group. And I think it's really important to point out that this was a very small-scale study designed to isolate a principle. We weren't trying to teach these children to read. We were trying to understand if they learn to read in this particular way. If you could imagine extending this from 3 days of learning to a full semesters of learning, you could see how these small gains could really add up to be a major improvement in phonics, which I think is what the West Des Moines folks are showing us in their pilot data. The other thing we observed in that study, which is really, I think, helpful to know, is when we broke it down in different groups, the girls and the boys, we found that both groups benefited from learning, the good readers and the poor readers. When we looked at different tasks, in every condition that we looked at, we found that variability showed better learning and better generalization. And in some cases, similarity didn't show learning. The poorest readers didn't benefit from similarity. Their performance was the same at pre and post test. The boys, for whatever reason, didn't benefit from similarity. They had the same pre and post test performance. But both groups showed good gains with variability.
So, Bob, I think some people are saying some students still learn the rules in sort of the traditional way, and they use them to learn how to read fluently. Could you just talk about what it is that they're learning and why the rules work for some kids and other kids need to have a different kind of set of experiences to derive the rules?
Well, I think it's important to, of course, we all realize that kids come to kindergarten and first and second grade with varying experiences of language. There's massive differences in how much language even children get during the preschool years. Differences in executive function, differences in outside knowledge, differences in vocabulary, all of which contribute to their reading in the end. Now, some kids do benefit from rules, but my intuition is that it's really the practice that they get after we show them the rules that's driving the effect. Certainly their ability to reason about the rules and to think about them is contributing some, and kids may vary in that. But ultimately, kids aren't learning to memorize rules. Kids are learning these skills, and it might be that the poor learners just need a little extra help, and they need a little extra training that's tuned to how they learn in order to catch up.
Okay, and we have another question here about using the ITA alphabet as a reading intervention and whether or not it really transfers. Could you answer that question, Bob?
I can try to answer that question. So the ITA alphabet is the International Teaching Alphabet. Is that the correct? Initial Teaching Alphabet, which is an alphabet which tries to ensure a more one-to-one correspondence between letters and sounds. So there's a lot less ambiguity. Now, at some level, that's actually good. We know from work in languages like German that have a much more transparent orthography that kids struggle a lot less. I think the challenge with the ITA is transfer. Once kids master the phonics system with the ITA, how do they transfer to regular text? And I think that just gets us right back to the role of variability, which is that the children tend to lock in on whatever you teach them, and it may not be all that flexible, and that's where variability comes to play. It helps them form something more abstract. Learning the ITA, for some of the kids, they may end up locking in on that. So I don't know. There may be ways to integrate these ideas more, but I think at this point that's the best I can offer you.
Okay. And so, Bob, if you could just, Bob McMurray, if you could just talk for very briefly about extending the learning principles to other sort of units, like the syllable unit, and how the variability improves students' ability actually to quickly recognize not just single syllable words or focus on the vowel, and then how that also transfers into fluency, which we know if they're more fluent, then they have more time for reading, for meaning.
Well, I think the critical factor here, and this remains to be tested in the laboratory or hopefully in the school as we've been doing, is the more variability, for example, in syllable structure that kids see, the more likely they are to abstract the invariant relationships, the fact that there's usually a consonant at the end and the beginning and a vowel in the middle. And when they're seeing multisyllabic words, for example, they're learning something more abstract. And so I think variability can play a really positive role there. I think variability can play a positive role in getting kids to generalize other phonics knowledge. What was the second half of your question, Carolyn? I'm really sorry.
And then once...
fluency.
Fluency, and actually mapping to the underlying syntax of oral language. Good readers, we know, automatically do that. And again, that word automatically comes into play. How do we give them experiences so that they can, in fact, make those generalizations?
And I think that's the critical thing. By adopting approaches like variability that come from a model of teaching automatic skills, what we enable children to do is learn the words faster, learn to recognize new words faster, and learn to decode the text faster, which then allows them access to the higher level aspects of language. We've all seen children struggling to pronounce a word, and when they finally get it, they've forgotten what the previous word was. And it's only when they can start to understand text in a sort of fluent and automatic way that they could possibly achieve that kind of comprehension that we're looking for.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Davis, Suzanne, and Christy, can you describe the students that are the sort of third and fourth graders who should have been already reading for comprehension that were still struggling, what their changes in their reading behavior were, and with some of the gains in fluency, words per minute, that you saw?
You know, I first have to say what I noticed when I did the reading records with them is that they were, the self-corrections, they started to self-correct their work. So they'd read a sentence, realize there was an error, they'd go back and correct it. So it told me they were making meaning and that they were able to sound out all of the words. They were reading more accurately. I noticed there was much more natural phrasing. And so, you know, throughout the weeks, I started to notice that all of a sudden their words per minute were growing. And I had one student that grew, a fifth grader, like 30 words per minute. So we started to notice that. And since they were having more natural phrasing, they were able to comprehend what they were reading. And so their comprehension thus improved. Christy, do you have anything to add?
I also think something that I really noticed too was even with just not their reading, but in their writing, their confidence for spelling words, for reading words was improving. And like I've shared in the past in the story, in one of our conversations was, we had an ESL boy that absolutely was terrified kind of reading out loud or decoding words out loud, and once he was on the program for a while, he was able to learn how to syllabicate those words, and he was then showing his whole entire class how to pull a word apart and put it back together.
Wow, well that is excellent, and I think we're just reviewing here to see if we have any other outstanding questions that we didn't get to. Did we get to all of
I didn't see any other
the questions that came in?
Can I add one other point that I think is maybe really relevant to educators? In introducing a variable practice type model into your teaching is very counterintuitive. We seem to be taking the kids who are doing the worst and making it a little bit more difficult for them. And I think in the short term, you might even find that the kids seem to struggle a little bit, but what decades of research on this in all sorts of different cognitive and motor skills suggests is that this is really what leads to the most robust generalization, it leads to the best retention, and it leads to the best automaticity in terms of the ability to use the skill. And so I think that's just a critical thing to think of, and I know it feels a little different, it feels a little counterintuitive. We certainly got a lot of pushback when we started doing our studies on this, that, well, I can't believe that adding this variation would actually help children, and yet the results are very clear in lots of different domains that this is a useful thing to be doing.
And so there's been a lot of work coming from cognitive science, and it really captures, I think, what you just said about desirable difficulties, that it is only when you really push them so that they have to see what is important and they can then integrate it and generalize it. And so this would be consistent with that line of work on desirable difficulties, is that right? I think
it is consistent with it in the broadest sense. I think it's a subtle difference, though, in that it really tries to focus on what you're going to make more difficult. And I think here the essence is you want to make things more difficult that aren't quite relevant to what you're trying to teach. And other things, you may actually want to make them less difficult. If you're teaching vowels, you make the consonants a little more difficult. And you make the vowels a little less difficult. And so in a way, it's telling us what difficulties are desirable so that we can tune our curriculums to support that. So I think it's very consistent with that broad idea, although I think it also helps us refine it some.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. And to that point, I mean, that we have worked considerable amount of time to identify those contrasts in the curriculum of Access Code with your help and with the data that we've learned from the students in West Des Moines and around the country. So hopefully we'll continue the research and continue to understand what those conditions are that maximize, and then given that the technology can actually optimize learning situations for individuals, the goal is to make it so that their learning actually is personalized and they get the information that they need as learners. All right, we're certainly interested in any feedback or questions, further questions. We have just a few minutes before we wrap up. We really appreciate those participants who joined us today, and we hope that it's been useful, and we look forward. We're going to do a couple of additional webinars, and I'll just put our next webinar up on the screen. We're going to talk about intervention for special needs students and talk about students who have already been identified as needing special education and how a variable practice model actually enhances their learning. That's on Tuesday, October 9th at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. All right, thank you very much.